Welcome and thank you for joining us. Our topic today is faith-based diplomacy, a field of soft power diplomacy most effectively conducted by and on behalf of Israel. We are honored to have with us two outstandingly knowledgeable experts on Christian Zionism and its long-standing relationship with the Jews and modern Israel. Speaking to us from Jerusalem is the Reverend David Pileggi, rector of the Anglican Church of Christ in Jerusalem's Old City, the oldest Protestant church in the Middle East, consecrated in 1849. That was just a few years after the Anglican German Lutheran bishopric had been created there in the early 1840s. And speaking to us from Madison, Wisconsin, is the historian Daniel Hummel, PhD, author of the highly authoritative work on Israeli Evangelical Relations, Covenant Brothers, published in 2019. Gentlemen, it is a pleasure. Before introducing each of you further, my name is Philip Earl Steele. I'm a scholar of Christian Zionism and am pleased to be representing the 3Cs Association, based here in Warsaw, Poland. In November, just a few weeks away, we'll be launching a new foreign affairs journal. And in the very first issue of 3Cs, that's the name of the journal, one of the main focuses will be faith-based diplomacy as an expert field of Israeli diplomacy. This is the third webinar in our four-part series on Christian Zionism and Israeli faith-based diplomacy. I now wish to turn back to our guests. First to you, Reverend Pileggi. You have lived in Israel for 4 decades. Early on, you wrote your MA in history at Hebrew University. You have been the rector of Christ Church since 2008. Among your many efforts is teaching Christians about their faith's roots in Judaism. You also lead tours to pre-World War II Jewish sites in Central Europe, including here in Poland. So Reverend Pileggi, David, I welcome you. Thanks for agreeing to speak with me. You're an important expert, David, on 19th century Christian Zionism. So together with Daniel, an expert on 20th century Christian Zionism, today we can offer some broad and deep insight. My own focus has been more on the 19th century, and you have helped me in the past years regarding Reverend William Hechler, most famous for his close relationship with Theodor Herzl. But 19th century Christian Zionism reaches back much earlier than to William Hechler. So please, David, do give us a sense of Christian Zionism's broad sweep in the 19th century.
Well, we need to, first of all, thank you for asking me to join you in this endeavor. I think it's important that people realize that what we might call Christian Zionism, Restorationism, Philo-Semitism, that this dates back to the Puritans and perhaps even before. And I would suggest that a generation after Luther and Calvin, or after at least the beginning of what we call the classical Reformation, that Protestants having full reign to read and to interpret the scriptures for themselves began to challenge the traditional church understanding that saw Israel and the Jewish people in allegorical terms, or oftentimes when Christians in the Middle Ages read, if they had the opportunity to read or knew how to read or heard about ancient Israel or Jerusalem, we thought of those places in I don't know, metaphorically or spiritually, or somehow that the text was talking about the Christian church. And one of the things that the Reformation brought about was reading the text in a very simple, a very simple way. In Hebrew, it's called the Peshat, what is the simple meaning of the text that we're reading? And the Protestants in France, Switzerland, Germany, simply said, well, if the Bible is talking about Israel, or if it's talking about the Jewish people, it is not talking about something spiritual or otherworldly. It's talking about the real people of Israel. If the Bible is talking about a restoration or a return of Israel to the land, it is talking about some kind of literal fulfillment. This impacted the Puritans, and it was Puritan, you might say Puritan eschatology and Puritan Bible reading that in a way influenced British life, British public life, and even influenced in a very widespread way the Anglican Church, even though ironically the Anglican Church was oftentimes at loggerheads, had many disagreements with the Puritans. So this, what we call Christian Zionism, comes to us, at least in the English-speaking world, through from continental Europe, through the Puritans, and then of course it went to places like North America and Australia, and so on.
Well, but tell us about some of the events in the 19th century then, if you would. I'm thinking, of course, of Lord Shaftesbury and Elizabeth Tona, some of those figures who predated Hechler in the 19th century.
Well, if you want to talk about the 19th century, we have to back up just a little bit and speak about the late 18th century, where Europe, Britain and Europe, I don't know if I should include the two or separate the two, but Britain and Europe, yes, they were the beneficiaries of spiritual renewal and revival. This revival, at least for those of us who are English speakers and know something of our church history, it starts with Wesley and Whitefield, and then as we get to the end of the 1700s, the revival or the renewal begins to catch hold amongst the British aristocracy, the rich, the famous, and this, you might say, this revival, this renewal brings about an interest in Bible reading. And I would suggest, Philip, that wherever you have people who read the Bible, wherever you have a community that is in love with the biblical text, you will almost always find that that community has some kind of interest or perhaps even great love for the people of Israel and their spiritual and material well-being. And so it was the revival of William Wilberforce and Charles Simeon that started in the 1790s, continued into the 1800s, and it was this revival that reignited passionately an interest in the well-being of the Jewish people. It took hold, especially in a very strong way, in the Anglican Church, but of course, Baptist and later what became the Methodist Church, they were also impacted by the revival, by Bible reading, and thus by the interest in the future, the well-being of the Jewish people. So it's you might say, the evangelical revival, the late 18th and the beginning of the 19th century, that sets the course for the entire 19th century. Now this happened in Germany, and where we had the Pietist movement and other places in Central Europe. It wasn't exclusively a phenomena that occurred in the English-speaking world.
Mm-hmm. Well, tell us about William Hechler himself then, if you would. I know you're probably the most important expert on his career, and a fascinating one it is.
So to say something about William Hechler. William Hechler, in many ways, embodies the values of the Anglican revival, evangelical revival of the early 19th century. He, you might say, very interesting family background. He had a German father and an English mother. His German father was a Lutheran pietist. His mother was an English evangelical. And like many serious Christians at that time, there was an interest in in world missions and bringing the story of Jesus, the gospel, the Bible, bringing this to British colonies, especially around the world. And William Hechler's father, Dietrich, was a missionary in India. And when he was in India, Dietrich's wife died, and he returned to the United Kingdom. And he needed a job. And he said at that time, I always recalled my interest in the Jewish people. In fact, here's something that's quite instructive and really very important to realize, because the minute we start talking about Hechler, or we start talking about 19th century evangelicals, the issue of prophecy comes up. And of course, many of my Jewish friends have repeatedly told me, you Christians are really interested in us because you have some kind of sneaky eschatological agenda, and somehow we are like for you pieces on a chessboard, and if you can move us into a certain position, then your Messiah will return. Well, I have to say that criticism, whether it's of William Hechler or whether it's of many other evangelicals of the period, is really unfair. So Dietrich Hechler, he had this deep romantic notion. When he grew up as a young man and he was reading his Bible in southern Germany, he was from the area of Baden, he wanted to be Jewish. He so identified with the characters in the Bible. He loved the biblical story. He loved the biblical text. He loved the characters, that were central, to that drama. And so he has this deep identification. You might say it's romantic, that's for sure, because his identification pretty much wasn't with the Jewish people of the 19th century. He identified with the Jewish people of the 3rd century or 4th century BC. But there was, again, this deep identification. He passed that on to his son, William Hechler, who followed in his father's career, you might say. William Hechler became an Anglican priest, and eventually, because of his connections, he ended up becoming the chaplain to the British Embassy in Vienna. All his life, William Hechler had a fascination with Jews and Judaism, and ironically, he knew more about Judaism and Jewish tradition than his good friend Theodor Herzl. And all his life, Hechler had a fascination with prophecy, and he was expecting the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. And interestingly enough, his prophetic scheme was quite simple. He simply believed that most of the prophetic events prophesied, for example, in the book of Revelation, or as he understood the book of Revelation, he believed that these events had already come to pass, and that the key event, or the one thing that was lacking, was the Jewish return to the land of Israel. And he was waiting, had a sense of expectation, like a lot of prophecy folks who are enamored with prophecy. He's making calculations and he thought that 1897 or 1898 would be the year in which the prophecies would be fulfilled. And he was quite excited when he met Theodor Herzl in 1896. Actually, Herzl met him. Herzl actually sought him out, went to look for him. And Theodor Herzl said to William Hechler, I know you have connections with many powerful people throughout Europe. I need to get into contact with the German Kaiser, Wilhelm II. And he said, I need to do this so that the Jewish people will believe in me and follow me. And William Hechler basically said to him, I'm really excited. I think your movement has been prophesied. But interestingly, he said, I will not do anything to manipulate or to humanly, you might say, try to fulfill prophecy. So I'm not trying to bring about the end through human efforts. And he this is underlying understanding was, if this is God's will and this is God is in this, then God will bring it about. It is not something that we engineer, although it is something that we as human beings must cooperate with. And so Hechler ends up becoming what the Jewish Chronicle once noted. Hechler is the foreign minister of the Jewish people for just about 4 years, from 1896 to 1900. He is an Anglican priest, and quite an eccentric character. He was not a lunatic. He was not crazy. He was eccentric and certainly in a very British way, but he was clever, and he was virtually a genius. And Herzl admits as much in his diaries. And he engineered Herzl's rise, you might say, from being a nobody, simply a journalist of a well-known newspaper, and put Herzl on the world stage, and had the German Kaiser and other diplomats and world leaders recognizing Herzl and negotiating with Theodor Herzl, yes, over the future of the Holy Land. And that was all done within a few years. And it was done, I believe, largely thanks to the invaluable help of William Hechler, who was simply the chaplain of the British Embassy in Vienna.
Right. Well, thank you so much. Great answer. I'm sure that's going to tell our listeners a lot. Christian Zionism over the past hugely important decades relates most of all to evangelical Christians. And the Anglican Church is not properly part of that branch of Christianity. But please tell us about the relationship between the Anglican Church and Christian Zionism, the Anglican Church attitude towards modern Israel.
Oh my goodness, I think it's a fairly complicated question. I would say that perhaps the place to begin is to acknowledge that there might be somewhere close to 70 or 80 million Anglicans in the world. We are told that we're the third largest denomination. And when anybody mentions the word Anglican, most folks think of the Church of England and maybe the Episcopal Church in the United States. But most Anglicans live in the global South. In fact, the average Anglican looks something like this. She's 21 or 22. She probably walks half a kilometer a day to collect water. Half of her family is underemployed, and several members of her family have had HIV. So we're talking about a church of the poor in the global South, a church in Nigeria or Uganda, a church in the Congo, Argentina, India, Singapore, which is somewhat wealthier than the above mentioned. And it is a church that is probably 80 to 90% of the church membership. The churches, these folks, I should say, they're either evangelical or charismatic. Yes, even leaning into Pentecostalism. And their attitude toward Israel and the Jewish people would be somewhat different than the attitude that people have, for example, the Church of Canada or Anglicans in New Zealand. And here we have a certain divide in the church. I would say that Anglicans in Uganda have a fairly warm relationship with Israel, or they think very highly of Israel and the Jewish people. And Nigeria would be the same. They appreciate Israel biblically. I wouldn't say that the average Anglican in Uganda has a very well-developed theology about Israel and the Jewish people. They simply have, you might say, warm feelings. I don't think there are any, there's no hostility based on liberation theology, or there's no notion of replacement theology. They simply identify with Israel as being, something positive and being something in the Bible. They identify with Israel because it was once a developing country and it has become very wealthy. They have notions about the Jewish people being, blessed or, highly intelligent when they read about how many Jewish Nobel Prize winners there have been. And there's also something that's a little harder to talk about. In many places around the world, in the global south, Christian communities are rubbing up against Islam. And they see Israel as having the same experience. And so they can identify with Israel, on that basis, as well. In the United States, you have a different story. And the British Anglicans, especially many Anglicans in the United Kingdom, there's a certain guilt about colonialism, and there's a certain bitterness still about the humiliation and the way in which the British left Palestine in 1948. And that bitterness, that anger is reflected in a hostility towards Israel, towards maybe not so much towards the Jewish people, but this is certainly a different reality. So it just depends on where, what Anglican church you're talking about.
Right.
Which country.
My last question regards Poland then. You've been conducting tours here to Poland, visiting sites connected with the pre-war Jewish community here, and tell us something about those tours and what purpose they're to serve.
Well, we here in Jerusalem, we've been doing tours for years on the Jewish roots of Christianity, or the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, and how we can better understand our faith as Christians by delving into that Jewish world of Jesus. And this is, for many people, quite an eye-opener, but you might say it's only the first chapter of the story. And so as we teach that we as Christians need to appreciate the Jewish people and to show some honor and respect to them. And we also teach that, that we do as Christians have a certain connection with them, perhaps spiritual connection, not ethnic connection, and that we should have some interest in, the Jewish story and Jewish history. And so as a way of continuing or to pursuing an understanding of that history, we've been, I think, for 15, 16 years, bringing groups to Poland, talking about the Jewish story in Central Europe and in Poland in particular. We try not to focus only on the Holocaust, but of course that is quite a big part of the story. And I think what's been happening over the years, you might be interested to know, is that the more that we do these tours, the more we have to take into account Polish history, Polish culture, Polish religion, because the Jewish people, of course, are shaped by Poland and Polish culture. So while we started off just almost exclusively talking about the Jewish life before the war and Jewish culture and Jewish spirituality, we now include a huge amount of Polish history, and Polish culture, and relations with the Soviet Union, and the phenomenal contribution that Pope John Paul II has made to Jewish Christian relations and theology in general. So every year it's continuing to kind of expand and to be a bit more contextual.
Wow. Well, fantastic. I hope to see you here in 2021 with your next tour.
I hope so too. Try to arrange this COVID thing for us, would you?
Okay. Our guest has been the Reverend David Pileggi. Thank you so much for joining us, and hope to see you soon then.
Thank you for your patience.
We have good editors about this. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. Our topic is once again faith-based diplomacy, a field of soft power diplomacy, most effectively conducted by and on behalf of Israel. We are honored to have with us one of our two outstandingly knowledgeable experts on Christian Zionism and its long-standing relationship with the Jews and Israel. Speaking to us from Madison, Wisconsin, is Professor Daniel Hummel. I'll say something about myself now before saying more about you, Professor. My name is Philip Earl Steele, and I'm a scholar of Christian Zionism working here in Poland. I'm very pleased to represent the 3Cs Association based here in Warsaw. In November, right around the corner, we'll be publishing the first issue of our new Foreign Affairs journal, 3Cs. One of the main focuses of which will be faith-based diplomacy. This is the third webinar in our 4-part series on Christian Zionism and Israeli faith-based diplomacy. I now wish to turn to our guests. Waiting for David to join us, let me introduce Daniel. I'd slated you to be the second speaker, but you'll be the first today. Daniel Hummel is an evangelical Christian who is on staff at the Upper House, a Christian study center on the campus of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he is an honorary research fellow. Professor Hummel also obtained his PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is the author of Covenant Brothers, Evangelicals, Jews, and U.S. Israeli Relations. This came out just last year in 2019. Professor Hummel, Dan, your book, which picks up the story really in 1948, together with the creation of the Jewish state, is very neatly organized using terminology from the Apostle Paul, from his letter to the Romans. So you divide it essentially into 3 blocks, one on the roots, the second on the shoots, and then on the branches. I think it's a very apt format you present, and I think the easiest thing to do would be to ask you to tell us then, to begin with, of course, about those roots. Your book focuses on the coalition building that commenced at once with the creation of the Israeli state and the development of the evangelical infrastructure in the U.S. So please then, if you would, tell us about those roots in the period 1948-1967.
Well, thanks, Phil, for having me. I'm delighted to talk to you about the modern Christian Zionist movement. What I want to say beforehand, that those metaphors I use of roots, shoots, and branches in the book are really to talk about the post-1948 Christian Zionist movement. And I want to be clear that the roots of Christian Zionism go far, far back before 1948. But my question in that book and in my research more broadly is sort of how do we get from a set of ideas or a set of theological arguments to an actual political movement that is today encompasses millions of people, millions of dollars, organizations, and actually has a lot of political sway in the US and actually has sway growing in other areas of the world as well. So when I'm talking about roots, I'm really asking sort of where do we see the beginnings of a political program and sort of the institutional roots of the Christian Zionist movement. So three that I think are important. The first really is looking at the missionaries in Israel in the first 20 years of the state of Israel's existence, and the ways that they develop their understanding of what it means to be a Christian in a Jewish community, in a Jewish society, and ultimately how they reinterpret what it means to be a missionary. I talk about it as they talk about it in this way as well. They enter Israel as missionaries trying to gain Jewish converts, and that never totally goes away, but they ended up talking about themselves as being Christian witnesses. And what they meant by that was a type of being of Christian in the world that took account of the reality of the state of Israel, which obviously had not existed for a very long time. And the Holocaust, and what the Holocaust's what does the Holocaust demand of a Christian, recognizing its perpetration in Europe by Christians, you could say, and the missionaries developed a sort of what I would see as like a proto-political Christian Zionism that understood the role of the Christian, if you lived in Israel, to sort of support the Jewish state, help Israel succeed. And that idea filtered back through, I look particularly at the Southern Baptist missionaries that were there, but filtered back through into the American evangelical community. And so that's one of the roots that I look at. Another is in the 1950s, and I should say those missionaries, many of them were actually there in the 1930s and had to leave during World War II, and so they came back. One of the lead missionaries, Robert Lindsay, was actually in Israel since 1946 after the war. So he actually witnessed the 1948-49 war in Jerusalem. The second route that's very important and maybe one of the central ones is the founding of the American Institute of Holy Land Studies in Jerusalem. It's now known as Jerusalem University College. But it was founded in 1957 in Jerusalem by an American named G. Douglas Young, who was a fundamentalist turned evangelical, who sort of worked in the same circles as Billy Graham. They knew each other at least. And Young developed a passion for Zionism through a number of channels, but two that were important was Young was a scholar of the ancient Near East and of biblical history. And he was part of a broader growing interest in biblical archaeology that focused on the Jewish history in the Holy Land. And Young was a dispensationalist, which is a type of theology in the United States, and particularly among fundamentalists and evangelicals, that saw the creation of Israel in 1948 as prophetically significant. And I should mention many of the missionaries, the Baptist missionaries, were not dispensationalists. So they did not develop their interest in Israel or in the Jewish people from prophecy. And I think there's often like a misunderstanding that prophecy sort of drives all of the interest in Israel from evangelicals. And that's not the case. Though Young, it definitely was part of his rationale. But Young really develops you could almost call it a guilt complex, but a very deep sense of responsibility to protecting, as far as he could, protecting Israel because of the Holocaust. And so you can see a thread coming through One of the key explanations for why Christian Zionism grows in the 20th century is one reaction to the Holocaust by Christians to sort of commit to not let that happen again. So Young's Institute is actually founded as an education center, and you can do graduate work there still on biblical archaeology. But Young was very explicit when he founded it that it would also be a place that would be providing a different narrative of Israel than what Young saw as the pro-Arab dominant narrative at the time. And so he talked about creating ambassadors for Israel among evangelical clergy, in particular, people who were doing graduate work, who would come to the Institute, who would do their work, but also be immersed in Israeli society, and then would go back to the US and be sort of pro-Israel in their pulpits, in the organizations they ran, and that would sort of create a long-term arc of pro-Israel sentiment among evangelicals. And that really does work, and I'll pick up that story after 67 as well. And then the third route is less tied to any particular person or institution, but I look at the concept of Judeo-Christianity, which sounds like it has a long, long history, but it's actually a quite recent term. It's mostly, you can find versions of the term like Hebrew Christian and stuff in the 19th century, but the way that a lot of Americans used Judeo-Christianity to talk about their own history is rooted in the 1930s and 1940s, and it's actually to contrast American society and American democracy to fascism and communism. It becomes a very popular term to describe American, the sort of roots of American morality and ethics is that we're a Judeo-Christian nation. And that is really popular all across the spectrum. It's actually more popular among more, you would call them liberal Protestants. People like Reinhold Niebuhr are very into this term. And evangelicals pick up the term as well, but they tend to mean something more specific and more rooted in a sort of a theological understanding of Judeo-Christianity. But the upshot of the term for the story of Christian Zionism is that Israel, and particularly the state of Israel after 1948, is come to be seen as the homeland of Judeo-Christian civilization. And so it takes on an added, not just theological, but cultural significance for millions of evangelicals.
Identity.
Sorry, go ahead.
Identity.
Yeah, it becomes part of evangelical identity. Yeah, and you can see this even today. There's a lot of, I remember reading an article about Mike Huckabee, who led a tour group to Israel, and sort of one of the first things he does when they get off the plane, he says, "Welcome home," to these evangelicals from Georgia or Texas or something. But they're to see Israel as their home, and there's definitely a religious part of that. There's obviously the Bible takes place mostly in that area, but there's also a very strong cultural tie between American culture and Israeli culture, in the sense that these are both part of a bigger unit called Judeo-Christian culture. So those are the three roots I look at, and the time before 1967 is not a time of mass politics. These are small groups that are sort of building institutions, but they're on the small scale. They're trying, Young and the Baptist missionaries are trying to get their ideas out, but they're a small fish in a very big pond. But they are because of their longevity, because they're in the game early on, once we get to the post-67 period, they actually have an advantage, and they can really sort of capitalize on the work they've been doing for decades. So that really takes us up to 67. Those are the roots I sort of situate the movement in.
Well, 67 is a very important dividing line because of the Six-Day War. The name itself suggests creation, as in the book of Genesis, and your chapter here on the shoots now stretches from 1967 to 1976, and tell us, why is that a period, and what encapsulates it?
Yeah, and you can see even the period, it takes up a third of the book, and it's much shorter than the other two periods. So there's a lot happening in this decade right after the 67 war. Obviously, the 67 war is a massive, geopolitical and military victory for Israel, and it is also significant for Americans. A number of Americans, American Jews, are very interested in the war, as you can imagine, and the sort of decade after the war when you talk about American Jewish support for Israel, one recent historian has called it the golden age of American Jewish support for Israel. Sort of very full-throated, not a lot of caveats in the support. And you can see some of that in the evangelical response as well. So on the evangelical side, the 67 war is seen as prophetically significant by a lot of evangelicals. And that gets back to that dispensational theology that is looking for, among other things, Jews to control Jerusalem again. And obviously the upshot of the war is that Israel now controls not only Jerusalem, but a lot of the biblical sites in the West Bank and other areas. So that's one part of the story, is that there's a growth in prophetic interest by evangelicals. But there's other things happening as well. Another one is that there's a massive growth in Holy Land tourism after the war. It's really like a sharp increase, to where by in about 1970, there's about 70,000 American Christians touring Israel in a given year, and by the end of the 1970s, there's hundreds of thousands. And it's hard to know sort of who those Christians are. There's obviously a number of, America's a diverse place when it comes to Christianity, so not all those Christians are evangelicals, but certainly a number are. And the numbers tell, it's pretty clear that on average, an evangelical who goes to Israel and experiences sort of a traditional evangelical tour comes back very much impressed and interested in supporting Israel in ways that they wouldn't have been before going. So that's another part of the story. A key part is tracing those people I talked about in the roots part, and particularly Douglas Young and his institute. Young is successful in really bringing some top flight evangelical scholars to his institute that also connect him to a lot of very important evangelical leaders, including Billy Graham, who might be at this time, or not even might, is for sure the most important evangelical. And Graham was already friendly with Israel. He was friendly with Israeli leadership. But Graham really starts weighing in on Middle East politics in this period of 67 to 76. And this is also the period when Graham is very close to Richard Nixon and really all presidents, but particularly Nixon. And so you have in the late 60s a number of evangelical leaders, the head of the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the largest denomination in the US, bar none, the head of the National Association of Evangelicals, Billy Graham. They're all getting plugged into pro-Israel politics at this time. Another thing that emerges as part of Young's project is the growth of actually interreligious dialogue between Jews and Christians. And this is something that not only people like Young are interested in, but the Israeli government is interested in this. There are Israeli scholars, Jewish Israeli scholars that are interested in this. And another key player is the American Jewish Committee in the United States that's very interested, which is probably the leading American Jewish organization at the time, very interested in developing interreligious dialogue with Christians. And that that goes back to a long-standing American Jewish concern when it comes to Israel, that the U.S. is a majority Protestant country. And so to sort of secure American support for Israel, it might be a good idea to develop interreligious dialogue around Israel. And so for the 40s and 50s and into the 60s, most of that dialogue took place between liberal Protestants who were much more interested in ecumenical and interreligious dialogue and American Jews. In the 67 war, the liberal Protestant response is lacking, according to American Jews. It's there's a lot of equivocation. There's concern about Christians in Arab countries and what sort of coming out strongly for Israel would mean for those Christians. These are the calculations that liberal Protestants are making. On the other hand, you have these evangelicals who are very, very supportive of Israel. And so in the 70s, the American Jewish focus shifts from liberal Protestant to evangelical dialogue. And it switches dramatically, almost sort of flipping the priorities of American Jews. And so by 1976, you get organized Jewish evangelical dialogues that are bringing in a lot of leadership on both sides. And crucially for the story of Christian Zionism, they're not just focused on theological or historical issues. They're focused on Israel and sort of how are you going to live out this new commitment to interfaith or interreligious dialogue? And that's often framed as, for Christians, you need to support Israel. That needs to be part of the package. And so, this might seem like a small story of sort of elite theologians talking with rabbis and stuff like that. But if you look at the language that they're using, they're invoking Judeo-Christianity all the time. They're invoking the Holocaust as a reason for Christian support all the time. These become a lot of the arguments that get picked up as the movement starts growing in numbers in the 80s and beyond. And so there's a lot of things happening. I look particularly at that tourism focus in one chapter. I look at interfaith dialogue. I should also mention another thing is that the Israeli state becomes much more interested in developing an evangelical essentially lobby in the US in this time. And so even as evangelicals are touring Israel in new high numbers, one of the things I look at are a couple Israeli politicians or bureaucrats who tour America in the late 60s as well. And they're gathering intel on what is, American Christianity is very confusing. There's not a clear structure to it. And so the Israeli government's really learning a lot at this time as well, by doing their own tours, by talking to people like Young, and developing a sense that, the evangelical bloc is sort of the wave of the future for American politics. And that's a sort of sentiment that's also in American politics, that there's sort of a rising conservative, silent majority is the term Nixon used. But Israelis are listening to all that and doing their own research and picking up on that as well. So they start dedicating more resources to growing their evangelical support. And crucially, this is under labor government. So there's often an idea that the sort of Christian Zionism isn't really important to Israelis until you get to the Likud governments of the late 70s, and that's not the case. In the mid 70s, in the early 70s, the labor governments are basically doing the same thing, understanding that evangelicals are sort of going to be important in the future of American politics, and so it's a good idea to befriend them and get to know them. So those are all happening, and I end in 76. One, because that is the year of the evangelical in sort of, that's what one magazine called 1976. It's a year when evangelicals suddenly become a very salient category in American politics. It's also, the last year of labor leadership as Menachem Begin becomes the prime minister in 1977. And you start seeing a generational shift in the Christian Zionist leadership from people like Young dies in 1980, but from people like Young and the missionaries sort of fade away, and a new generation of leaders are coming up, and those are people that are more connected to the Christian right that's emerging at the same time in the US. And so that sort of takes us into the branches of the third part.
Right, the third part of your book, The Branches, exactly, and that extends from 1976, 1977 to 2018. Your book, of course, came out in 2019. What about those branches? That's a very dramatic and exciting period, after all. It's in fact a kind of a fruition.
Right, and you can even see it as a failure on my part as an author. Branches just means there's a lot of stuff happening, right? So it's hard to even summarize sort of what it is. So I decided to summarize it as there's just a bunch of branches of movements happening. But why I call it branches, because I do see them all coming out of the same history. And so it's not just sort of random groups popping up in the US, around the globe, but they are all sort of linked to the story I've been telling so far. But the main branch, I think, particularly for an American story, is the Christian right, which is a term that sort of, the term can be interchangeable with something called the religious right. These are, terms of American political history or American politics, of politicized evangelicals and fundamentalists who really start organizing They make a big splash in the 1980 presidential election, voting for Reagan. Their big issues at the time are sort of pro-life politics around abortion, and conservative religious values. They're anti-tax, they're pro-military, sort of the Christian right that we still have in a lot of ways. And there's pro-Israel is in there. That's one of the really two foreign policy things. There's the Cold War and Israel, and those are the two foreign policy things. And so, I look a lot at Jerry Falwell, who becomes the leader of the Moral Majority, who's one of the more important Christian right leaders. And he is a prime example of someone who, he goes to Israel in the early 70s for the first time, really becomes interested in Israel after that, but doesn't say a lot until the late 70s. And then when he does start talking, he mixes a lot of, Falwell is also a dispensationalist, so he has some of that prophecy language in there. But he really talks about interreligious relations between Jews and Christians. He talks a lot about the Holocaust and the importance of Christians making sure that doesn't happen again. And he just uses a lot of the language that someone like Young was using 20 years before that. Mm-hmm. But he's also not, he knows who Young is, but he's also got his own base of support and his own institutions, and he's not really interested in jumping on board stuff that's already happening. He's interested in creating his own organization and leading from there. And so the issue of Israel gets incorporated into the Christian right's bigger policy agenda list. And this could, in one way, this was a boon for Christian Zionism. It made millions of Christian right grassroots people take note of Israel in a way they might not have before. On the other hand, someone like Falwell is pulled in 10 different directions in any given year, and Israel's just one of them. And so he wasn't nearly as dedicated. I mean, he was very pro-Israel. He had a very prominent relationship with Menachem Begin. But Falwell's main bread and butter issues were more domestic American domestic politics issues. Mm. And the same goes with his successor sort of in that role, which was Pat Robertson in the 90s, and the Christian Coalition, which became a very key domestic Christian right organization. And the same with Robertson also had a penchant to say things that were controversial. And so that really, both Falwell and Robertson did that. And that really took away from some of their effectiveness. But both of them were really pulled in a lot of different directions. And so it doesn't come until 2006 in the creation of Christians United for Israel that you get a Christian right-based single issue organization around Christian Zionism. And that's led by John Hagee, and still is led by John Hagee. And what I see as sort of the strength of that organization is its singular focus on sort of Christian Zionist politics and organizing for that. And so, the people within Christians United for Israel certainly are conservative on a lot of issues, but they don't weigh in on all those issues. They just weigh in on a single issue. And that has made them very effective in DC in pushing their, what they think are the right policies in U.S. Israeli relations. So that's the main branch. We can get back to that if there's more interesting stuff there for sure. There are other branches.
Uh-oh, I've lost the voice. Do you hear me? I don't hear you. Uh-oh. I'm not on mute. Do you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you. Do you hear me now?
Oh, yeah. No, I do. Now I do. Suddenly I hear you.
I don't know what happened. I'll pick it up from the global. Is that?
Okay, yeah, please do. Please, yes.
Yeah, okay, that sounds good. Okay, so the other branches I look at are the globalization of Christian Zionism since the late 70s. And this is really the part of the story that was most surprising to me when I started the project of Covenant Brothers, which was seeing how... Sorry?
This was the biggest discovery for you?
The biggest surprise. I don't know if it's the biggest discovery. It just, I wasn't expecting to go the places I ended up going, which was looking at Brazil and Nigeria and South Korea,
right,
and these places that I just didn't know that there was strong and growing Christian Zionist support.
Right.
And the key to understanding that support is that it comes particularly out of the growth of Pentecostal Christianity, which is a version of Christianity that's very similar to evangelicalism, but also different in important ways. And that within the Pentecostal tradition, Christian Zionism is seen as prophetically significant, that the Pentecostals believe in a lot of the same sort of prophecies around Israel. But there's also a very clear sense that God's going to bless those who bless Israel. And this is a sub-theme that comes up over and over again in Christian Zionism, but it's usually not at the forefront. But for Pentecostal Christians, the verse in Genesis 12:3, where God tells Abram, I'll bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you, and through you the whole world will be blessed. That Pentecostals really read that literally, and really like as a transactional guarantee by God that, if we bless Israel, then God will, directly bless our country, or will directly bless me as an individual. You hear both of those types of ways of talking. And, someone like Falwell cited that verse as well, but he thought of it in a very vague way, like, and he actually focused a lot more on the curses. So, America shouldn't stop supporting Israel because God might cause the decline of America. But for Pentecostals, it's a very tangible, concrete guarantee from God. And so, one of the interesting things is seeing how Christian Zionism is really popular in developing countries where they're looking for every edge that they can economically and diplomatically. And so you'll hear pastors in Brazil or South Africa talk about how part of their economic plan needs to be to support Israel because God will bless those who bless Israel.
It fits in nicely with the prosperity gospel, after all.
Yes, and that I call it a nation-based prosperity gospel for that sort of collective blessing. And John Hagee is also part of this. I mean, he got his name preaching this type of theology. And so even the American movement now is led by that stream of Christian Zionism. But in the U.S., Christian Zionism is obviously very powerful right now. Particularly in the Trump era, we'll see where it is after the election. But there is a sense that there is a uncertain future for Christian Zionism in the U.S. Younger evangelicals are far less interested in Israel than older evangelicals. John Hagee is in his 80s now, and it's unclear who's going to succeed him. And so the story in the U.S. is one of uncertainty. In the world, it's if you're looking at it from a pro-Christian Zionist perspective, it's a very rosy future. I mean, the growth is just remarkable. And even in places like Brazil, the growth of Pentecostalism is remarkable. And then the prominence of Brazil-Israel relations is remarkable. And so if you're looking at this from Israel's perspective, that might be, in 20 or 30 years, there might be a number of countries whose Christian Zionist demographic is such that that country is pro-Israel, largely based on the sentiment of the Christians in that country. And so that was just a surprising and unexpected future for the movement that I was much more focused on the U.S. at the beginning of the project, and came to really appreciate how the U.S. is definitely central to the story and is still, because of the U.S.'s geopolitical power, is still the most important ally of Israel. But that the future is uncertain, and yet Christian Zionism is here to stay for a long time. And it might look significantly different once non-Western Christians take the leadership roles. It's still largely led by American and even European leaders. So the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem is the largest Christian Zionist organization in the world, even bigger than Christians United for Israel. And it's led by mostly European Pentecostals right now. But you could see, once there's a sort of turnover, it might be led by non-Western evangelical Pentecostals, and that would be a significant departure for the history of Christian Zionism as well.
The foreign policy journal I represent, 3 C's, named after the new political initiative here in Europe, intends to give a lot of focus to the potential in applying the Israeli model of faith-based diplomacy in Poland's own relations with the United States. Obviously, these would not be covenant brothers, But among the Christian countries of the Old West, Europe and North America, it really is only Poland and the United States where Christianity remains so vibrant. So there's a sort of a natural affinity that might be incubated, as it were. What sort of possibilities do you, Dan, see for Poland to develop a relationship with the religious right at large, using Israeli models for that kind of diplomacy?
Yeah, and I don't know much about the specifics of the Polish situation, but I can say there are some sort of maybe rules for domestic lobbies in the U.S. that might be sort of applicable to understanding how Poland and the U.S. would interact. And these are, you know, the Israel lobby, if you want to call it that, the lobby of Americans who are very interested in Israel. That's not a unique phenomenon in American history. There's been the China lobby, the Cuba lobby. There tend to be these sort of, for very, you know, real historical reasons, it's not just random. There are particular groups of Americans who get very invested in particular foreign policy relationships. You know, I'd say one really, you know, striking thing about a lot of these lobbies, including the sort of evangelical Israel relationship, is how they emerge, and this might sound, it sounds different now, but they emerge as bipartisan lobbies. So Christian evangelicals weren't, you know, you go back to the 60s, and evangelicals weren't card-carrying Republicans. That comes later. They were about 50-50. And so the sort of American political party politics was one thing that was trying to be transcended in the evangelical Israel relationship. And it wasn't just on the evangelical side that it was bipartisan, but as I mentioned before, it was a bipartisan effort by the Israeli government. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, that was one of the keys for this relationship, is that both sides developed bipartisan relations. And so no matter who was in power in Israel, and no matter really what the American political situation was, there were people in power advocating for the relationship. And that seems to me to be a key to the success, the long-term success of pro-Israel politics in the U.S. It's changed recently in that since Christians United for Israel emerged in 2006, Christian Zionism has been almost exclusively related to the Republican Party now. Mm-hmm. And that's given it strength in one way. It's had a lot of influence in the Trump administration. But you can also see that that is perilous, because if a Democratic administration emerges, they're not going to be at all interested in listening to Christians United for Israel. They're going to see them as the sort of the people that they have to manage during their administration. And that's a little different than other pro-Israel groups like AIPAC, who has really attempted to maintain bipartisan support. And so it remains to be seen sort of which model maybe is more effective, but historically it's been bipartisan on both sides. Another sort of rule of lobby building or strengthening relationships is that it's often a combo of top-down and bottom-up activism. And you can see that in the evangelical Israel relationship, in that on the evangelical side, people like Young and the missionaries, the Baptist missionaries, they're not household names for the most part. I mean, they're known in their own circles, but they were sort of bottom-up or mid-level evangelicals who were really passionate about one issue and managed to focus all their energy on those issues to really change the conversation there. But they really didn't get a lot of success on a broad scale until people like Billy Graham and other evangelical leaders took notice. Mm-hmm. And so it was sort of a combination of grassroots activism and elite buying into that activism. And you could say the same thing on the Israeli side, that it's definitely important that different prime ministers, including Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir, right, knew the importance of gaining Christian support in America, but they weren't actually the drivers of reaching out to evangelicals in the first 20 or 30 years. There were a lot of mid-level bureaucrats that were doing that. People in the foreign ministry, people in the Ministry of Religious Affairs, who weren't, who really aren't notable. They're not mentioned in history books now, outside of certain stories about religious diplomacy. And so it was very important that those people were working, though, in the 60s and 70s to build contacts with evangelicals, to sort of shift focus in those ministries. But then it's also very important that people like Menachem Begin and Netanyahu today are very publicly supportive of the evangelical relationship. And so in both cases, there's sort of a bottom-up and a top-down approach to building the relationship. And I think it falls apart if there's not both of those sides. And then the last thing I'll say, and this might not be the most encouraging thing, but just looking at the Christian Zionist movement, it's just an inherently unstable movement. I've given you sort of a clean narrative here. There's a lot of times where things could have totally fallen apart. When we even get to the Christian right, where there's this sort of built-in millions of people are sort of primed to support Israel, it took decades for this single organization to emerge. And one part of that is that the Christian right in America is very personality driven. And so when these personalities come and go, things build up quickly and then fall apart quickly. And that you can't discount sort of scandal as being part of all of that. So it might not even be sort of normal politics, but it might be some scandal that sort of drives some Christian right leader into exile or whatever. And so there's just an inherent instability to these types of lobbies. And the key that really made Christian Zionism household lobby was creating that organization that focused specifically on this issue, that got a lot of political support at the time. And I even mentioned when CUFI was founded, they had bipartisan support. Joseph Lieberman, a senator, an independent senator, spoke at their first event, and that was really key for them, that it wasn't just Republicans speaking. But it remains to be seen. The Christian United for Israel has always been under one leader, which is John Hagee. It remains to be seen if it can survive after him. I could see it surviving and there being a sort of strong institutional presence. I could also see it sort of dissipating and returning to the norm of the 90s or the 80s, where there are just a bunch of smaller organizations that are pursuing their own things. And there is a sense of general pro-Israel sentiment, but there isn't that one organization that can sort of channel and claim to speak for millions of people at once. And that really is what made Christians United for Israel such a game changer, was that it could claim to speak for this big voting bloc, much like AIPAC has claimed to speak for American Jews as well. And that's also been, that's been challenged in recent years as well. But that instability always has to be built in. It's not foreordained or inevitable that evangelicals will be politically influential when it comes to Israel.
Well, thank you very much. Professor Daniel Hummel has been our guest here. Thank you so much for your time and your insights. I look forward to speaking with you again. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
A delight. Thanks.